Hey there, brother friends and sister friends. Welcome back to the Heart Set Above podcast, a space where we seek to keep our hearts anchored in the things of God while we learn to navigate life in a world that is so far from Eden. Today, we are finishing up our series on internal family systems, or IFS, which is a therapeutic lens that helps us understand the different parts of our inner world. And over the past several episodes, we've been slowly walking through this model together. Before we talk about the final stage of IFS, I want to pause for a moment and recap the journey that we've taken. Because honestly, if you've learned how to do the work we've discussed in the first several episodes, you've already learned the most important part of this model. In the first episode of this series, we introduced the idea that our inner world is made up of parts or patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving that developed over time in response to our life experiences. And these parts are not bad. In fact, they're usually trying to accomplish something very good for us. They're usually trying to protect us. And so in the next few episodes, we focused on protector parts. We learned that protectors develop strategies to keep us safe from pain. And sometimes those strategies are helpful, and sometimes they become rigid or extreme. But underneath those strategies is always a good intention. Protector parts want to help us avoid rejection, shame, abandonment, humiliation, or pain. And then we learned how to get curious about these protectors. So instead of fighting them or shaming them, we began to ask questions. Things like, what are you afraid of? What are you trying to protect? What are you hoping to accomplish for me? And when we slow down and approach our protector parts with curiosity and compassion, often our protectors begin to soften. They begin to trust us. And when protectors trust us enough, they sometimes allow us to go deeper to the part they've been protecting all along, which is called the exiled part. And so these exiles are usually younger parts of us that carry pain and shame, grief, or distorted beliefs about ourselves. Beliefs like, I'm too much, or I'm not lovable, or I don't matter, or I'm not worth protecting. And in our last episode, we talked about how to connect with those exiled parts, how to see them, to understand their story, to validate their pain, and most importantly for Christians, how to invite God into that space, to allow God to hold those wounded places, to grieve with us, to speak truth into the distortions, and to offer His presence. Because often what those wounded parts needed most in those moments of pain was to know that they were not alone. Now, technically, there is one more stage in the IFS model, and that stage is called unburdening. Unburdening is the process of helping wounded parts release the burdens that they've been carrying for years. And so those burdens might be things like shame or fear or distorted beliefs about themselves, about others, about the world around us. Those painful things might be painful memories or feelings of unworthiness. Now, in traditional IFS therapy, once a wounded part is seen and understood and connected with through compassion, that part is invited to release those burdens. This often happens through symbolic imagery. Sometimes the burden is imagined as being released through an earthly element, right? Fire, water, light, wind, or air, and then earth. The idea is that once the burden is released, that part is free to return to its natural, healthy role within the inner system. Now, I want to be honest about something. This stage of IFS is not something that I practice with my clients. Part of that is simply because I have not pursued enough training in this stage of the model. And I think it's important to respect the boundaries of our training for the safety of our clients. So I leave that work to the clinicians who have been specifically trained in that process. But there is another reason that I personally pause here as well. And that reason is sort of theological in nature. Because as Christians, we believe that one day God Himself will fully unburden every part of us. When Christ returns, when all things are restored, when the brokenness of this world is finally undone, there will be a day when every wound is healed, every distortion is corrected, every tear is wiped away. So while models like IFS can offer beautiful tools for understanding our inner world, I personally don't believe that full healing of our wounds is something that we should expect this side of heaven. But that doesn't mean that meaningful healing isn't possible, because it absolutely is. If we learn the skills we've talked about in these first 5 episodes, learning to see our parts, to understand them, to offer compassion to them, to invite God into their pain, and to place them in God's arms for comfort, protection, and perspective, that alone can lead to profound transformation. Not perfect healing, but something deeply meaningful nonetheless. It can lead to connection. And if I had to choose one word to describe what I think Eden was like, it would be connection. Perfect connection with God, perfect connection within our own selves, perfect connection with others, and perfect connection with creation. And when sin entered the world, those connections fractured. But they weren't completely destroyed. They left behind echoes, remnants, longings. And I believe that tools like this can help us recapture small glimpses of that kind of connection again. Not fully, but partially, little echoes of Eden. Now, the only time I have personally experienced an unburdening process in my own inner world was during my IFS training. I had an exiled part of me that believed something very specific. It believed that I needed to rush through everything in life, that I couldn't take up too much of people's time, because if I did, they might stop loving me. They might stop listening to me. They might withdraw their love or their favor. In other words, there was a deep belief underneath that said, if I take up too much space, people will stop loving me. And because of that belief, I had several protector parts that were extremely vigilant about efficiency. Now, here's the funny thing. I still love efficiency. I'm always looking for ways to do things more efficiently. But originally, that drive wasn't just a personality trait. It was born out of pain. Those protectors were constantly doing mental gymnastics, trying to figure out not only how to say what I wanted to say, but how to say it quickly, efficiently, without taking up too much time or space. There were parts of me that always felt rushed, chaotic, cut off, because I was constantly editing myself internally to try to deliver only what I thought were the absolute bare essentials of my message. And in doing that, I often cut off the heart of what I actually wanted to communicate. And eventually, when I did this deeper IFS work, I encountered the exile underneath all of that. She appeared as a preteen version of me. She had long hair, a kind of wistful look about her, almost a bohemian feel about her, very different from my natural style today. She was tender and carefree. But she had never been given the time or space to fully process what she needed to process or communicate what was on her heart. And during the unburdening process, after sitting with God and hearing Him give her permission to take up as much time as she needed, I imagined placing her into a mountain stream. There was a waterfall pouring into the stream, and she stepped under that waterfall and began to kind of bathe in it. Water was the element we used in that unburdening moment. And in my mind, she remains there even now under that waterfall, taking a perpetual bath, being reminded that my permission to take up time and space does not come from other people. It doesn't even come from me. It comes from God. And He has declared that I am worthy of the time and space that I need to process through things. Now, even with unburdening that part, I would be lying if I said that after that unburdening experience, I never felt triggered again in my drive for efficiency. I still feel anxious sometimes when I think I'm taking up too much time or space. I still feel moments of insecurity that other people's love or favor will run out if I annoy them by a task taking longer than expected. Those old protector parts still show up sometimes. But now, when that old anxiety starts to rise, I picture that younger part of me under that waterfall, free, safe, held. And it reminds me of the truth. So, although this internal work that I did with this part was extremely helpful and the unburdening process was very powerful and cathartic for me, the reason I don't overly emphasize unburdening in my own work is because when I experienced it personally, it didn't erase all of those old patterns. What actually changed things the most was understanding where those patterns came from, seeing the wound part beneath those beliefs, and rooting that whole story in a God-centered perspective, or a heart set above. That significantly reduced the power that those patterns of beliefs had over me, but it didn't erase them entirely. And honestly, I'm not sure that that kind of full healing is something we should expect this side of heaven. But what we can experience is something beautiful. We can experience understanding, self-compassion, and deep intimacy with God, even in the midst of our pain. So as we wrap up this series on my take of internal family systems, my hope for you is simple, that you would learn to become curious about your inner world, to see your parts, to understand them, to offer compassion to them, and to invite God into every corner of your heart. Because in many ways, what our wounded parts have always longed for is simply to be held again by the God we were created to walk with in Eden.